In the spring of 1974, at a farm liquidation sale outside of Pratt, Kansas, a 31-year-old woman named Nora Tillman stood in a field full of men who were buying equipment and walked away with something none of them wanted. She didn't buy a tractor. She didn't buy a planter, a grain auger, or a set of field cultivators. She bought 42 Angus cross heifers that the auctioneer listed as, and I'm quoting him directly here, a mixed lot of young females, some open, some possibly bred, condition variable, no health records, buyer assumes all risk. He said it the way a man apologizes for something he can't fix. The heifers had been running on overgrazed pasture for 2 years. Their hip bones showed. Their coats were rough and dull, in the way that tells you the animal has been giving everything it has just to maintain body temperature. The man standing next to Nora at the fence offered $400 for the lot and dropped out at $550. Nora paid $680 for 42 head of cattle that 3 different men at that auction told her weren't worth hauling home. She hauled them home. Let me tell you about Nora Tillman, because what she did with those cattle and what she built from that $680 purchase over the next 22 years only makes sense if you understand who she was and where she came from and what she had already decided about the way she intended to live. Nora was born in 1943 on a section of mixed grass prairie in Pratt County, Kansas. The second of 4 children and the only one who never seriously considered leaving. Her father, Dale Tillman, ran a cow-calf operation on 640 acres that he had inherited from his own father and added to 40 acres at a time whenever a neighbor sold and Dale had the cash. That last part matters. Dale Tillman never borrowed money for land. He borrowed money once in 1951 to put up a hay barn, and he paid it off in 14 months and told Lenora, who was 8 years old at the time, that he had not slept comfortably for a single night of those 14 months, and that he did not intend to repeat the experience. Dale was not a machinist or a diesel mechanic in any formal sense. He was something rarer and harder to name, a man who had grown up during the Depression on a farm where, if something broke and you couldn't fix it yourself, it stayed broken, and who had internalized that reality so completely that by the time Lenora was old enough to hand him tools, he could diagnose a sick cow by her posture at 50 yards, rebuild a carburetor by feel in low light, and stretch $1 of farm income further than most men stretched 3. He kept a shop in a low concrete block building behind the house, with a wood stove in the corner and a workbench along the south wall that he had built from lumber salvaged off a granary that blew down in 1947. The tools on that bench had been acquired one at a time over 30 years. Each one bought used, each one cleaned and hung in a specific place. And Dale could tell you where every one of them came from and what he had paid for it and what he had used it for first. He taught Nora to read cattle the way other fathers taught their children to read books. He taught her to look at a hip and see the condition score behind it, to look at a coat and hear the nutrition history it was telling, to look at a pasture and calculate the carrying capacity before she ever put an animal on it. He taught her that the auction barn was a place where other people set your price, and that the only way to control what your cattle were worth was to control who you sold them to and how. Dale Tillman died in February of 1971 of a heart attack in the shop behind the house, which is where he would have chosen to go if anyone had asked him. He was 63 years old. He left Nora a paid-for farm of 720 acres, a savings account with $11,400 in it, the shop and everything in it, and a cow-calf herd of 81 head that he had spent 30 years selecting for frame disposition, and the ability to do well on grass without a lot of expensive inputs. He left her no debt. He left her 2 brothers who had moved to Wichita and a sister in Colorado Springs and a mother who had passed in 1967. He left her, most importantly, a way of thinking about money and land and cattle that she had absorbed so completely by the age of 27 that she could not have separated it from herself if she had tried. Her brothers offered to help her sell the farm. She thanked them and told them she'd call if she needed anything. She didn't call. Now, the heifers. When Nora Tillman looked at those 42 rough-coated hips showing, Nora records Angus cross heifers at that liquidation sale in the spring of 1974, she did not see what the man next to her saw. He saw a problem. He saw vet bills and uncertainty and the risk of open heifers that might not settle, and thin animals that might not make it through a Kansas summer without significant feed cost. He saw liability. He dropped out at 550 and walked over to look at a used hay rake. Nora saw genetics. She saw a frame that under 2 years of neglect was still correct. She saw hip width and shoulder depth that told her these animals had been well bred before they were poorly kept. She saw heifers that, with 60 days of good grass and a mineral program and a clean bull, would look entirely different. She saw, underneath the rough coats and the protruding hips, exactly the kind of foundation female that her father had spent 30 years trying to build his herd around. But that's not the whole story of why she bought them. The whole story requires a flashback of about 8 months. In the summer of 1973, Nora Tillman drove to Hutchinson, Kansas, and spent an afternoon in the public library reading every issue of the Kansas Stockman she could find from the previous 3 years. And then she drove to a farm outside of Haven and spent 2 hours talking to a man named Harold Getz, who had been selling beef direct to customers in Wichita since 1969. Harold was 61 years old and tired and looking to slow down. And he talked to Nora for 2 hours about what worked and what didn't, and what his customers actually wanted and what they would pay for it. She took notes on a yellow legal pad. She asked him what his average customer paid per year. He told her. She asked him what his cost of production looked like compared to auction prices. He told her that too. She drove home and sat at the kitchen table with her father's ledger and a sharpened pencil and worked the numbers for 4 hours. What she was building before she ever bid on a single heifer was a direct sale beef operation. Customers in Pratt and Kingman and Wichita who would buy a quarter or a half or a whole beef custom processed at a USDA-inspected locker plant in Pratt, paid by the hanging weight picked up or delivered. No auction, no commission. No price set by whoever happened to show up at the sale barn on a Tuesday morning in November when the market was soft and the buyers were full. Her price, her relationship, her customer. She had already talked to the locker plant in Pratt before she ever went to that liquidation sale. She had already driven to Wichita twice and knocked on doors in 3 neighborhoods and come home with 11 signed commitments from families who said they would buy a quarter beef if she could deliver it by the following fall. 11 families before she owned a single heifer. That's why nobody understood the purchase. They were seeing impulse. They were watching execution. The story traveled the way all stories travel in small farming counties. From the sale barn to the feed store on Main Street in Pratt. From the feed store to the co-op elevator. From the co-op to the lunch counter at the Rexall. From the lunch counter to the church parking lot on Sunday. A woman bought 42 head of sorry-looking heifers for $680 and hauled them home in 2 loads. The version that circulated had the heifers getting sorrier with each retelling. By the time the story reached the church parking lot, they were practically falling off the trailer. Her brother-in-law, a man named Gary, who worked at the Pratt County Farm Bureau, called her on a Tuesday evening and asked in the careful tone of a man who thinks he is being kind what exactly she planned to do with those cattle. She told him she planned to sell beef. He told her the auction barn was the way people sold beef in Pratt County and always had been. She told him she understood that. He told her he was just trying to help. She told him she appreciated it. She hung up and went out to check on the heifers. Let me tell you about the build, because this is where Nora Tillman proved that her father had taught her something that cannot be purchased at any price and cannot be borrowed from any bank. The heifers came home in April of 1974. She put them on her best native grass pasture, 160 acres of mixed bluestem and Sidiotes grama in the southwest corner of the farm that Dale had never overstocked and had rested every 3rd year since 1958. She put out a mineral mix heavy on phosphorus and copper, which she had calculated from a soil test and a body condition assessment, not from the tag on a bag at the co-op. She turned a clean Angus bull in with them in May. By July, you would not have recognized those cattle. Their coats had shed out smooth and black. Their condition scores had climbed from a 2 to a solid 4. 37 of the 42 heifers settled on the first breeding. The 5 that didn't, she sold at the auction barn in August, which was the only time that year she set foot in the place, and she got more per hundredweight for those 5 than the man next to her at the liquidation sale would have paid for all 42. The calves came in the spring of 1975. 34 live calves out of 37 bred heifers, which is a calving rate that a lot of established cow-calf operators in Pratt County would have been proud of. She lost 1 heifer to a difficult birth and 2 calves in the first week. 34 calves. She kept the heifers and sold the bull calves and finished beef. That was the plan. The finishing program was her father's thinking applied to a new problem. Dale had always believed that Kansas grass, properly managed, could put more gain on a calf at a lower cost than any feedlot ration, and that the reason people didn't believe this was that they were comparing grass-finished beef to grain-finished beef on the wrong terms. They were comparing it at the auction barn, where both sold by the hundredweight, to a packer who set the price. Nora was not selling to a packer. She was selling to a family in Wichita who wanted to know where their beef came from and was willing to pay a premium to know it. Her cost structure in that first full year, 1975 and into 1976, looked like this. Heifer purchase, amortized over the productive life of the herd, negligible. Pasture owned outright, no lease, no payment. The grass was there because her father had taken care of it. Mineral and veterinary, $41 per cow per year, which she tracked in the ledger to the penny. Bull service, she bought a registered Angus bull in 1975 for $900, paid cash, and used him for 6 years, which works out to $150 a year. Processing at the Pratt locker, $42 per animal, paid by the customer as part of the hanging weight price. Her price to the customer was $1.89 per pound hanging weight for a quarter beef. The auction price for comparable calves that year was running between 42 and 48 cents per pound live weight. She was not playing the same game. By the end of 1975, she had 23 regular customers, not 23 sales. 23 families who had bought beef from her that year and called her in the fall to reserve their animal for the following year. She kept their names in a notebook that she bought at the Rexall for 35 cents. She wrote down what they bought, when they picked it up, and whether they had any requests for the following year. One family asked if she could hold back more of the short ribs. She told the locker. Another family asked about ground beef by the pound separately from the quarter. She worked out a price. She treated every customer like a neighbor because most of them were the neighbors of neighbors. And in Pratt County in 1975, that meant something. If you have ever watched a community underestimate someone and then watch that person quietly build something the community couldn't see until it was already done, stick with me. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story I'm telling, because the part that's coming is the part that Nora Tillman never talked about in public until she was 60 years old. Let me tell you about what happened over the next several years, because this is where the story stops being about cattle and starts being about something else entirely. Between 1975 and 1979, Nora Tillman ran her direct sale operation with the same discipline her father had applied to everything he touched. She expanded the customer list by 12 to 50 names per year, not by advertising, because she never advertised, but by word of mouth from existing customers who told their neighbors and their coworkers and their church friends. She kept her prices steady, adjusting them once every 2 years by a small amount that tracked her actual cost of production, not the commodity market. When the commodity market spiked in 1973 and 1974, her price barely moved. When it dropped, her price didn't follow it down either. Her customers understood this after the first year, and most of them preferred it. They liked knowing what they were going to pay. They liked not having to watch the markets. She was saving in those years between $4,000 and $6,000 per year above her operating costs. She kept the money in a savings account at the First National Bank in Pratt and a second account at a savings and loan in Kingman because her father had taught her not to keep everything in one place. She did not invest it in the stock market. She did not put it into equipment upgrades she didn't need. She put it in accounts that paid interest, and she left it there. By 1979, she had 61 regular customers. She had expanded the herd to 112 cows. All of them descended from those original 42 heifers or purchased as replacements using the same eye her father had given her. She owned every acre she farmed. She owed no one anything. The locker plant operator in Pratt, a man named Vernon Schick, who had processed her cattle since 1975 and had watched her customer list grow from 11 names to 61, told her one afternoon, while she was settling an invoice, that she was running the cleanest small beef operation he had seen in 30 years of processing. He said it matter-of-factly, the way a man states something he has observed and verified. She thanked him and asked if he could add a second pickup day in October because her fall customers were backing up. He said he could. The word had stopped being funny sometime around 1977. The story that had traveled from the sale barn to the feed store to the lunch counter in 1974 had been a story about a woman who didn't know what she was doing. By 1977, the story was different. Farmers telling other farmers something they had seen with their own eyes. Her cattle are finished on grass, and they look like feedlot cattle. She's getting $1.89 hanging weight, and her customers are calling her in August to reserve for November. The feed store version and the co-op version and the lunch counter version had all shifted. Not to admiration exactly, not yet, but to a kind of cautious acknowledgement that something was working that wasn't supposed to work. Gary, her brother-in-law from the Farm Bureau, stopped by in the fall of 1978 and walked the pasture with her for an hour without saying much. When they got back to the gate, he took his cap off and rubbed the back of his neck and said the cattle looked good. She said, "Thank you." He said he hadn't thought it would work. She said she knew. He put his cap back on and drove away, and that was as close as Gary ever came to an apology, and Nora considered it sufficient. Now, let me tell you about what happened in the early 1980s. Because this is the part that Nora Tillman had not planned for, and did not need to plan for, because her father had already planned it for her, without knowing it. You know what happened in the farm economy in the early 1980s? Interest rates climbed above 18%. Land values, which had been rising through the late 1970s and had convinced a generation of Pratt County farmers to borrow against their equity, to buy more ground and more equipment and expand their operations, collapsed. Corn dropped below $2 a bushel. Cattle prices at the auction barn fell to levels that didn't cover the cost of production for operators who were carrying debt. The farm credit system was calling notes. The Farmers' Home Administration was processing more loan defaults in a single year than it had in the previous decade combined. Farms that had been in families for 3 and 4 generations were going to auction. In Pratt County specifically, between 1981 and 1986, 43 farm operations were sold at distressed prices or foreclosed. Nora knew most of those families. Some of them were her customers. Some of them were people her father had farmed next to for 30 years. She watched it happen with quiet sadness, not with satisfaction, not because she was better than them, but because she understood what had happened. They had built their operations on borrowed money during good times, and the borrowed money had become a trap when the times changed. They were not bad farmers. Several of them were excellent farmers. They were farmers who had trusted that the good times were structural rather than cyclical, and her father had spent 30 years teaching her that the only thing you could trust was what you owned outright. Her expenses in 1982 looked almost identical to her expenses in 1978. Her pasture cost nothing extra. Her cattle were paid for. Her processing fees had gone up slightly, and she had passed the increase to her customers with a letter explaining exactly why, and not a single customer had left. Her savings, which she had been adding to every year since 1975, sat in those 2 accounts drawing interest. And the interest rate environment that was destroying her neighbors was paying her more on her savings than she had ever earned before. She did not say this to anyone. She continued to farm. She continued to call her customers in August and take their reservations and bring their cattle to Vernon Schick at the locker in October and November. She continued to write their names in the notebook. In the fall of 1984, a farm of 320 acres that adjoined her property on the east side came up for auction. It had been the Hendricks place for as long as anyone in Pratt County could remember. Gerald Hendricks had borrowed heavily in 1978 to buy an additional quarter section and a new tractor and a set of equipment that he had needed and some that he hadn't. And when the rates climbed and the land values dropped and the cattle market softened, the note came due in a way that Gerald couldn't answer. He was 54 years old, and he had farmed that ground his entire adult life. The bank set the auction for a Thursday in October. Nora drove to the auction in her father's pickup, which she had maintained herself since 1971, and which had 212 zoos and miles on it, and no payments. She wore the same canvas coat she wore to check cattle. She stood near the back of the crowd, which was large because 320 acres of Pratt County farmland adjacent to a highway was not a small thing even in a distressed market. And there were land speculators from Wichita and a farm investment group from Kansas City that had been buying distressed land across the county for 18 months. The bidding opened at $400 an acre. The investment group from Kansas City pushed it to $550. A local farmer named Dwight Pryor, who had somehow kept his own operation intact, went to $575. The Kansas City group went to $600. Dwight dropped out. The auctioneer called for $610, and Nora Tillman raised her hand. She bid it to $640 an acre. The Kansas City group went to $650. She went to $660. They went to $670. She went to $680. They paused, and in that pause, she raised her hand again and bid $700 an acre, and the Kansas City group did not respond, and the auctioneer called it 3 times, and it was done. 320 acres at $700 an acre, $224,000. She wrote a check from the First National account in Pratt and the Savings and Loan account in Kingman, drawing from both, and she handed it to the closing agent without a word. The crowd went quiet in the way that a crowd goes quiet when it is rearranging everything it thought it knew. Not polite quiet, not respectful quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when a community-level assumption collapses in public and everyone present feels it at the same moment. A 31-year-old woman had bought 42 sorry heifers for $680 in 1974, and a woman who is now 41 years old had just written a check for $224,000 for the farm next door, while the men who had laughed at the heifer purchase were losing their own ground. The arithmetic was visible to everyone in that field, and nobody said anything because there was nothing to say. Gerald Hendricks was standing near the fence line when the gavel came down. He was not looking at the auctioneer. He was looking at Nora. She walked over to him and shook his hand and told him she was sorry about the circumstances. He nodded. He said he hoped she'd take care of the place. She told him she intended to. He said his father had put in the windbreak on the north side in 1938. She said she knew. She'd always admired it. He nodded again and walked to his truck, and that was the last time they spoke. And Nora carried that conversation with her for the rest of her life. Let me tell you how this ends, because the ending is the part that Dale Tillman would have understood without a word of explanation. Nora farmed the expanded operation. 1,040 acres of owned paid for Pratt County ground for another 12 years after the Hendricks purchase. She grew the customer list to 107 families by 1991. She raised her prices 3 times in that period, each time with a letter to her customers explaining her cost of production, and each time she lost fewer than 5 customers, all of whom came back within 2 years. She never advertised. She never sold at the auction barn after 1975 except to cull animals she didn't want in the breeding herd. She kept the notebook. Her niece, a girl named Cassie, who was Dale Tillman's granddaughter and had grown up spending summers on the farm, came back to Pratt County in 1993 at the age of 22, with a degree in agricultural business from Kansas State and a clear-eyed understanding that the thing she wanted to do with that degree was learn what her aunt had built and why it had worked. Nora put her to work, not in an office, in the pasture and in the shop, and at the locker plant standing next to Vernon Schick, learning how a hanging weight was calculated and why it mattered. And at the kitchen table in the evenings, going through the ledger year by year from 1974 forward. Cassie was 15 when Nora showed her how to use the post hole digger and the wire stretcher. And she was 23 when Nora sat across from her at that kitchen table and opened the ledger to 1974 and said, "Here's where it started, and here's what it cost, and here's what it became, and now I want to show you how to run it." In 1996, the Kansas Cattlemen's Association held their annual meeting in Pratt, and someone on the program committee who knew Nora's operation asked her to speak for 20 minutes about direct marketing. She had never spoken publicly about her operation before. She stood at the podium in a wool blazer she had owned since 1979 and looked out at 300 cattle producers across the state and said what she'd been demonstrating for 22 years without saying. She said that the auction barn is a useful tool for setting a floor price, but a floor is the lowest you can go, not the highest. She said that every year she sold at auction was a year she let someone else decide what her work was worth. She said that the customer who calls you in August to reserve their November beef is a customer who has already decided your work is worth something, and that relationship is worth more per pound than any spot market that has ever existed. She said that her father had taught her that a paid-for farm is the only farm a bank can't take from you, and that the same principle applies to a customer list. If you built it yourself and they came because of you, and they stay because of what you deliver, nobody can take that from you either. She said she had started with $680 and 42 heifers that 3 men at an auction told her weren't worth hauling home. She did not say what the operation was worth in 1996. She didn't need to. The people in that room could do the arithmetic. Gary, her brother-in-law from the Farm Bureau, was in the audience. He had retired the year before. He found her afterward in the hallway and shook her hand, and held it for a moment longer than a handshake requires, and said that her father would have been proud. She said she thought he already knew. Gary smiled at that, and Nora Tillman smiled back, and that was the end of a conversation that had started in 1974, when he called to ask what in the world she planned to do with those cattle. What do you see when you look at 42 rough-coated, hip-showing heifers at a farm liquidation sale? Most people see a problem. Nora Tillman saw foundation. Most people see liability. She saw genetics. Most people see a bad investment. She saw the first page of a ledger that would run for 22 years and end with a paid-for farm and 107 families who called her every August. $680 a liquidation sale in Pratt County, Kansas. A woman who had learned from her father that the only price that matters is the one you set yourself. The cattle nobody wanted in the hands of the woman nobody understood until the day she wrote a check that the county couldn't argue with. They said nobody wanted those heifers. She wanted them. That's the difference between someone who buys and someone who builds.